Thanks. Okay, I hereby move Amendment 2, 3 and 6. Amendment number 2 provides what I would suggest is a fairly non-contentious definition of what a livestock producer is. It means any person engaged in the business of selling livestock to a meat processing plant for slaughter, including the sale of livestock from a meat processor to another meat processor. Amendment number 3 defines a meat processing plant. Again, I would suggest relatively uncontentiously, it means any plant or premises where the business of slaughtering livestock or manufacturing or preparing meats or meat food products from livestock for sale or shipment in commerce is carried out. And I suppose that reference to in commerce, I suppose that it'd be a commercial activity as opposed to somebody who's sort of incidentally slaughtering, killing a pig at home. It was a relatively common practice in Ireland once upon a long time ago. At least I'm told that it was. I don't ever recall it happening or seeing it at home, but it was very common. Likewise, members of various religious minorities kill an animal at particular times of the year as part of their activities, so it rules them out. It means people who are commercially killing animals for meat products. Amendment number 6. Minister, this bill is about transparency, and I applaud the fact that there's an effort at transparency, but I suppose a bill on food transparency in the Irish context that doesn't mention meat processors, in my view, lacks credibility. It is not credible to not talk about the meat processors, given what we know in Ireland, given farmers' suspicions. I appreciate you may say they're unfounded, but there is a suspicion of price tampering. I mean, right now there's a huge amount of livestock from feedlots being slaughtered, and it's not coincidental that that's at a time when there's huge pressure on beef prices. And the use of feedlots is something that is, the use of feedlots, this time is just allocated to the first amendment, is it? I've moved on a bit, but I do get time for each amendment, I take it. All right. The use of feedlots is just one of the avenues open to processors to keep prices down. And this bill facilitates, it doesn't require anybody to do anything, but it facilitates you, Minister, or your successors to introduce legislation requiring very extensive reporting by meat processors. To report on the type of purchases, including grades and ages, quantity of cattle purchased on a live weight basis, quantity of cattle purchased on a dressed or dead weight basis, range of the weights of cattle purchased, number of cattle purchased which be quality assured. You've repeatedly said that that's very important. Premiums or discounts associated with weight, grade or yield or any type of purchase. And that's, I think, quite important in the context of ascertaining the premia that are paid, in particular for in-spec board BIA quality assured cattle. The terms of trade regarding the cattle. Meat plants may be required to report on forward contracts that were slaughtered, delivered under a formula marketing arrangement that were slaughtered, quantity and carcass characteristics of meat processor-owned cattle that were slaughtered, quantity basis, level and delivery month of all cattle purchased through forward contracts that were agreed by the parties. Meat processing plants may be required to report on average weight price paid per carcass, range of premia and discounts paid, weighted average of premiums and discounts, range of prices, grade of beef, cuts of beef, trim specifications and age specification of cattle. Meat processors may also be required to report on the prices they received for boxed meat or meat that's been animals that have been killed and are now vacuum packed. And that's hugely important because what There is some transparency in what farmers receive, not full transparency, and there's certainly, as I've alluded to earlier, a huge lack of transparency around the impact that feedlots have, processor-controlled, if not processor-owned feedlots, and their ability to use them to hammer prices, but there's no transparency whatsoever around the price that retailers are paying the processors. And unless and until we get transparency in that regard, we're simply never going to know where the profits are going in the food chain and who's getting what along the line. We're also never going to know, for example, the 30-month rule, which is not so important at this time of the year. My experience as a farmer, I should declare that I'm a farmer, it's declared in my all-earned interests. My experience is that really age specifications don't matter at this time of the year, but they matter hugely when there's a volume of cattle to be killed. And your bill, Minister, doesn't introduce transparency, and I respectfully say doesn't have the capability to introduce transparency in that regard, because if and when you introduce regulations, I don't believe you will introduce regulations, but if you were to, it'll be challenged by the processors on the basis that it's commercially sensitive, and the principles and powers set out in this bill don't facilitate you to introduce that specific legislation. So any amendment, any regulations that you bring in to that effect will be struck down, could be struck down as being unlawful. So in fact, in seeking to introduce transparency, Minister, you have avoided the elephant in the room, which is the relationship between processors and retailers and the role that I do, but I mean, I didn't agree that these amendments would be grouped, and I think in fairness, they're slightly disparate amendments that deserve an adequate discussion at this stage.
You will have a further 2-minute opportunity as we go around.
Yeah. So, Minister, I would urge you to accept these amendments, not because you have to implement regulations that I've set out here, but because you could implement regulations if you thought they were necessary, or more important, if the regulator that you're introducing thought that they were necessary. Because what you're proposing to do, Minister, is to give a regulator a job that he cannot do. A job that he or she and their office will be unable to do, which is to introduce transparency in the food chain, particularly where it comes to the murky world of meat processors in Ireland.
It's about trying to improve farm incomes and improve the lot of farmers. Improve the lot in terms of the policy we put in place, improve the lot of farm families in relation to the schemes we put in place, which we're massively backing through CAP, but also to improve the lot of farmers in relation to the price they're getting in any way that we can. By having as much transparency as possible in the food supply chain. And that's why this legislation, which is historic in terms of what its objective is and the rationale behind it, that's why we're bringing that forward. And that's why we're looking forward to having the Office of the Food Regulator up and running with the staff in place and with this legislation passed. And that's also then, we're seeking to future-proof the bill as well by giving significant powers for regulation subsequently as well within the bill, so that we, if necessary, and as we learn, that we can also provide through statutory instrument the necessary capacity to make sure that this office works and that the food regulator works in the way that we want it to work. So in relation to these particular amendments, I believe they're fully covered already through the legislation, the comprehensive legislation that's in place and having come through the committee stages and the earlier stages, and that we're already there in relation to them. And then listen, alongside this legislation, and many refer to the macro today. I met them along with Minister Hayden, Minister Hackett and the Taoiseach, led to the Taoiseach. Very good constructive meeting, but our objective is to back young farmers in every way we can. That's why in relation to the CAP programme, which we've introduced, which has just started in the last few months, we've increased by 50% the payments in Pillar 1 to young farmers, and also increased with national funding by 50% the payments for all of the schemes that are in Pillar 2, the various schemes that are in place. So for example, if you take the young farmer top-up now in Pillar 1, in the outgoing CAP programme, that amounted to just over €70 per hectare additional in terms of entitlement value for a young farmer, just over €70. In the new cap, which is just brought in the last few months, it's €170 per hectare increase per entitlement. That's what the government is doing in terms of trying to deliver for young farmers. That's a significant impact we're making. That's what we're about. But a key part of that is this legislation, which I believe is very comprehensive and will achieve the objective which we are aiming for. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy McNamara?
Minister, to suggest that the powers that are proposed to be given to you and your successors to make regulations requiring transparency in the food bill is already covered in this bill is patently incorrect. So, Minister, I'd ask you where you or the regulator have the power to require beef processors to provide data on the amount of feedlot cattle that are being killed, because that has an important impact on pricing. They're used to push down prices. That's why they control so many feedlots. Feedlots that were previously owned or controlled by farmers who were driven out of business by those very processors. It's not, the power of these meat processors is not unique to Ireland. I mean, it's the same as the power of the meat packers in the United States, and that's why the reporting requirements in this bill are taken pretty much from the USDA Law 106 of 78, which was passed by Congress in October 22, 1999. Now, the meat packers in America were no more happy with this proposal than the meat processors here would be, but they have withstood their various legal challenges. They are being implemented. I'm not saying the system in America is perfect, but it's there. Minister, the only powers that the regulator will have, that you're proposing, is to collect, analyse and regularly publish reports on price and market data relating to the agricultural and food supply chain and generally in relation to the agricultural and food sector in the state. But the problem is there is no market data on the impact of feedlots. There is no market data on the requirements of supermarkets around age, the impact of the 30-month rule. There's none. There's no data whatsoever on the price that processors are paid by retailers. So they both say to angry farmers who are justifiably angry, less so, by the way, during the lifetime of this Dáil than in the previous Dáil, but I fear in future Dáils, you know, it's cyclical. There will be anger again. And the retailers and the processors will point to each other and say, well, there's the bad guy, there's the guy that you need to be protesting outside, not me, because I'm not making any money out of this. I mean, I might have managed to buy the building that the Department of Health is in, but I never made a rex out of the business. It's laughable. And you talk about historic. Minister, you championed this in opposition. You do have a historic opportunity to bring in powers to provide for transparency in the food chain, but the failure to do that is historic and lamentable, Minister. So I urge you to reconsider your position.
Minister, if you'd like to respond.
Thanks, listen, I mean, this is a historic opportunity and one that we are grasping in government and driving forward. That's why months and months of effort have gone into this. That's why we've consulted with farm organisations across the country. That's why the Ag Committee, and I see Deputy Carthy here today, who was one of those in the Ag Committee who put in very, very significant work in relation to that report and the 20 recommendations, 18 of which I have accepted or substantially accepted. And that's why it's got to the stage where this bill is very robust and very strong, and also why it provides the powers for further regulations as necessary to ensure this office works and delivers and has the teeth necessary. So listen, I mean, in relation to, we discussed the macro walk, and listen, I mean, the day that a farm organisation or a union or anyone says, listen, everything's okay, is the day we can all retire. By their nature, they will always, rightly so, organisations will always be pushing their case all the time. But when I met Macra, and I'm listening, and I will continue to listen, continue to seek to do more. That's why in terms of, and I have been listening over the last year and a half, travelled the whole country in relation to putting the CAP together, travelled to every county, met with Macra, met with all farmers who wanted to participate in the process to make sure that the CAP that we've introduced backs farm families, and particularly backs young farmers. So I mentioned the fact now that for the top-up, that up to last December, it was just over €70 per hectare for a young farmer for 5 years. Now, in the last few months, that's increased to over €170 per hectare. In relation to TAMS, now the significant supports that are there for farmers with new on-farm investments, 60% grant. In the outgoing CAP, that was available for 200 investment items, ranging from slatted sheds to machinery, slurry machinery, for example, milking parlours, etc. I've increased that now, and this government has from 200 investment items to 300. An extra 100 items there now, which young farmers can get 60% grant for, under TAM, 60% grant for. Really seeking to back them and make sure that we give every opportunity for young farmers to get in there and get up. And we'll continue to seek to do more as well, and work and listen to MACRA and other farm organisations in relation to how we can support them.
McNamara.
Minister, I have to say, you use the word historic quite a lot. It is historic only to the extent that never has so much been offered and so little by way of concrete powers to a regulator delivered. Where does the regulator have the power to ascertain the impact of feedlots? How will they do that unless there is a possibility to give them the power? Of course, you don't have to. It's merely that you're enabled to make regulations to that effect. Where will the retailers be able to find out where will the regulator be able to find out what the retailers pay the processors and what conditionality there is around that? Because that information is available as a result of legislation in the United States. It is available in France. Perhaps not as much as French farmers would like, but it's there. So where are those powers? And why do you not, is it you, Minister, or your department that doesn't want the regulator to work? Because yes, it is historic that you're setting up a big office, a regulator. And I'll make you a prediction, it'll be entirely staffed by retirees from the Department of Agriculture. So where is the power to deliver transparency? And what does is it you or your department don't want transparency? And if not, why not? Because nobody believes that there's transparency in the food sector in Ireland. And you are one of the few people who believe that the mere establishment of somebody called regulator will bring transparency. But they won't and can't bring transparency unless regulations can be made by you or your successors to give them the powers to seek the information needed to know where the profits are being made in the food chain. Because massive profits are being made in the food chain, but they're not being made by producers, and retailers are paying the price, and we have no information on anything in between, and we will have no information on anything in between as a result of your bill, and that's why I'm proposing these amendments.
And now moving on to amendment number 3, and it has already been discussed with 2. How stands that amendment, Deputy McNamara?
Pressed.
Okay, so amendment is being pressed. So is he on cash now on a chakti atar hivna cash to abrigi ta? The chakti atar niguina abrigi nil? So go on cash culture. The amendment be made. Thorough result. Ta quiga shocked. Yes 57. Neil Shaska off no 68. Sheelam gwil bucha eran gesh. Agricultural and Food Supply Chain Bill 2022, report stage amendment number 4 in the name of Deputy Michael McNamara. The question is that the amendment be made, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Thaw, na Chachti Michael McNamara, agus Michael Fitzmaurice, Neil na Chachti Hildegard Naughton, agus Cormac Devlin. On the question that the amendment be made, thorough result Thaw, Quiga Shocked, yes 57, Neil Shaska Ocht, no 68. Sheelam Gwil an Kesh Butcher no Gil Butcher an Gesh. Agus Bogan Bijarai Guji Lassu a Kuig.
Basically, the bill as it stands enables the Minister to make regulations prescribing unfair trading practices. What those unfair trading practices aren't defined in the bill. So from that, one assumes that one goes to the legislation which it is sought to implement in Ireland, which is the directive of the EU 2019-633 of the European Parliament and of the Council of the 17th of April 2019 on unfair trading practices in business-to-business relationships in the agriculture and food supply chain. And while that may sound reasonable, the fact is that there has been a huge discrepancy in how that is applied across the member states, and furthermore how it is applied in Ireland, because I was a member of the Agriculture Committee, as was Deputy Fitzmaurice, from 2011 to 2016. Deputy Fitzmaurice, I think, joined us in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lot of discussion, largely at Eamon O'Queeve's behest at the then Agriculture Committee, that Andrew Doyle, TD for Wicklow, was chair of. And it was through that I suppose we learned that the transparency that existed in Ireland was quite different to in other countries, and the practice and how producers in particular were treated was quite different in Ireland to how they were treated in other European countries. Deputy Richard Bruton, then Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, I think was the brief, introduced a statutory instrument which prescribed a lot of activities. You could say he was before his time, because that 2016 regulation was quite similar in many respects to what was brought in by the socialist government in Spain in 2020, and Royal Decree 5 of 2020 introduced a lot of protections for farmers, or producers rather, I suppose is the better term, because it's broader than farmers. To much applause from the food sector and food producers in Spain. However, in 2021, during COVID, which was the great cover for lots of, if you wanted to do something and didn't want people to know about it or discuss it or have any great concerns about it, because they were concerned either for their health or concerned at the draconian legislation that was being promulgated by this House, or promulgated by the Minister for Health, facilitated by this House. Those protections which Minister Bruton had brought in 2016 were considerably watered down by Minister Troy, as he then was, Deputy Troy as he now is. So I suppose, for the avoidance of any doubt, this legislation specifically allows the Minister to bring in regulations prescribing certain practices. It doesn't require the Minister to do it, but it enables the Minister to do it should he feel the necessity to do so. And of course, the Minister, under the bill as it's framed, takes recommendations from the regulator. Some of the recommendations are around prohibiting deferrals of payment of agriculture or food products that exceed 30 days or any other reasonable period set down in regulation, because the time period prescribed by Minister Bruton was changed, and I'm subject to correction in this, was changed by Minister Troy. For no apparent reason. I mean, obviously it made life easier for the Tesco's, the Dunnes, the SuperValues, the Lidl and the Aldis, but it made life a lot more difficult for producers. One of the important things that can be introduced is that one of the parties to a commercial relationship may not cancel an order for perishable agricultural and food products within 30 days prior to the seller's delivery date. Now, that's explicitly taken from the Spanish Royal Decree that I mentioned. That Spanish Royal Decree is explicitly set out for the purpose of implementing this unfair unfair trading directive. So, I mean, if it can be done in Spain, I don't see how it can be done here, because we know that the number of horticulture producers in Ireland is decreasing year on year. We know that, notwithstanding being a country ideally suited to growing food, including horticultural products, that more and more and more of it is being imported. We know that has a detrimental effect on our environment, because obviously imported food has a far greater carbon footprint than food produced in Ireland. I mean, ideally, if we're serious about the environment, eating, organic carrots that are flown from one part of the world to another isn't going to help our environment in any way. And we know that we need to protect horticulture producers in Ireland. because they can provide us with security of supply. Because there was a huge uproar in England, less so in Ireland, when shelves were emptied out because of adverse weather conditions in the south of Italy and the south of Spain, where a lot of the horticultural produce that we have comes from. So we do need, it's in the interests of our environment, it's in the interests of our economy, and it's in the interests of safety and security of supply. It's also, of course, traceability, the fact that maybe less preservatives have to be added to fruit and vegetables if they're travelling from North Dublin into the shops in Dublin, or from Kinvara and Ballyvaughan and Bell Harbour, that area up to Galway, or from Ogonnelloe down to Limerick, than if they're being brought across the world. So for all of those reasons, it's very important to protect horticulture producers. Now, we talk a lot about it, but year on year, horticultural producers go to the wall. Year on year, there are less of them in Ireland. So we do need to protect them, and we need to protect them as fully as possible, not with a minimal standard introduced in the lifetime of this government, but ironically, well, I don't know whether it's ironic or not, but it was but introduced by persons who support this government when they were in office and in a position to make regulations. So, Minister, I suppose I just want to be clear, it doesn't require you to do anything, but it facilitates you to ensure that a broad range of fair trading practices are adhered to. And on that basis, I would urge you to consider the amendment.
As you mentioned, the hello money, etc. Yes, that is dealt with in the bill, as are many, many, many unfair trading practices. And then, really importantly, the bill gives the power through regulation to the Minister to add to that, and in a way that is practical, so that it can be effective and changed. And the power given now through this Dáil and through the Shannon, hopefully after this, for the Minister and for the Government to be able to do that into the future. And that's what this is all about.
As
the proposer, you have 2 minutes. You can
but save to correct the record of the Dáil. The new watered-down amendments in 2021 were not made by Deputy Troy, as I previously said when he was Minister. As Minister, he did repeal the regulations made by Minister Bruton, but the new watered-down regulations were in fact made by Minister McConnell in 2021, so I think it's important to clarify that, as Deputy Troy isn't in the House. Other than that, I wish to press the amendment, and I don't think there's any point speaking further on it at this point of the evening.
Agricultural and Food Supply Chain Bill 2022, Amendment number 6 in the name of Deputy Michael McNamara. The question is that the amendment be made, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Thaw na Chachty, Michael McNamara agus Michael Fitzmaurice, Neil na Chachty, Hildegard Naughton agus Cormac Devlin. On the question that the amendment be made, thorough result, Thaw Cuigashe, yes 56, Neil Shaskashe, no 66, Thaw Bucha Eran Gesht.